What is up, everybody? We are live with another edition of the State of Bitcoin podcast. And I'd like to thank everybody listening on Podcasting 2.0 apps, especially those streaming and boosting me sats. Those are greatly appreciated. And I've got a special deal for you plebs coming up here with Black Friday and Cyber Monday coming up. You can use promo code Green Candle for 30% off your punch plates at codl.co. That's CODL.co. Get yourself a punch plate. Get that Bitcoin off exchanges. Use a punch plate to punch in your seed phrases and store those things away. It's a great deal. 30% off is only going to last until Cyber Monday. So be sure to get it and before then, and yeah, get that corn off exchanges. We've seen enough with this debacle of FTX and all this other stuff. So if you haven't learned by now, get it off and use a punch plate to type in those seed phrases. But I've got a very special guest, Luke Mikic. I believe I pronounced it right this time, but he's the host of the Bitcoin Made Simple podcast. You do a lot of great writing for Bitcoin Magazine in your own Substack, Medium, whatever, and a recent guest on Preston Pishcop podcast. So congratulations on that, and welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, man. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, man. So let's get it started. Tell us a little bit about yourself. I've heard you in, Twitter Spaces and in other things like that. You sound, very well educated when it comes to macroeconomics and all that kind of stuff. So, how did you kind of get into that? And tell us a little bit about the orange pill story as well.
Well, funny enough, I'm actually very uneducated, very unqualified. I actually found Bitcoin in 2017. I was at university studying a double major in maths and chem because I didn't know whether I wanted to be a doctor or an engineer. Found Bitcoin in 2017, took a gap year from university, and just for the sole purpose of studying Bitcoin full time. I started my own business, which is like a personal training business in 2018, which kind of gave me an income and freed me up enough time to study Bitcoin. So since 2018, I've been studying Bitcoin full time. I suppose that's my orange pill journey. In 2020, I thought, hey, I've been trying to learn about Bitcoin for the past 2 years. I'm having trouble orange pilling people. I might just start up a YouTube channel and a podcast. So I started making educational videos about Bitcoin in 2020. And since probably late 2020, I've been in the Bitcoin space full time because early 2020, I saw the draconian measures being pushed down in Australia. And I thought, boy, I'm not going to be complying with these measures in the future. So I better shut down that personal training business due to all of the health regulations that I thought would be coming down the line. So 2020 was the final ripcord for me when I left fiat world and entered the Bitcoin space full time. And since then, I've left Australia and I'm working full time writing articles for Amber, which is a great Bitcoin only company. We just rolled out to 62 countries around the world actually with Amber. And I'm obviously got my own podcast, which is produced and edited by Amber. And I also manage a social media account as well, which is Coinbeast, another Bitcoin only company I work for. So yeah, full time in the space, doing lots. And I'm just glad to meet people like yourself.
Yeah, for sure. And awesome stuff, dude. But you said you started kind of working in Bitcoin full-time 2020. There's been a lot of wild rides as far as the volatility, the price run up, price coming down, the COVID crash down to 4K. So how's your experience been like working in, the Bitcoin only world and everything like that? I've seen a lot of, obviously we've seen a lot of these shitcoin casinos and other like crypto related companies come crashing down, but it seems like Bitcoin companies are just steady and building. So what's the experience been like, working in a Bitcoin only kind of world during this wild and volatile time?
It's very different to some of my friends because I have some friends in the whole crypto space and they haven't quite swallowed that orange pill that I've been, forcing down their throats for the past few years. And obviously the crypto company is going bankrupt. So everybody working over in the crypto casinos, they don't have a job anymore because they've all gone to zero. All of the largest companies in crypto look as if they're either on the brink of bankruptcy or they're already bankrupt. Volatility. The volatility in Bitcoin is something that I've kind of felt from day one. Like I was watching Bitcoin in 2017 as it went from like 5K to 20K in the space of like 2 to 3 weeks. And I was thinking, boy, I've got to start paying attention to this thing. This is wild. But yeah, volatility is just something that's par for the course with Bitcoin. And like Bitcoin's a young emergent technology. Somewhere between 1 to 5% of the world owns some Bitcoin. Of that portion of the world that actually owns some Bitcoin, how many of those actually understand Bitcoin? I would say it's very few. So obviously that's why Bitcoin is so volatile today, because it is so young in its adoption curve. So I love the volatility. I embrace it.
Yeah, and let's get into this adoption curve, because you recently wrote an article for Bitcoin Magazine about the recent bull run cycle. The article is titled "Is this bull run Bitcoin's final cycle?" And it kind of goes into a little bit about the network effects and overall just the technology adoption. So why don't you get into that and kind of where you see us right now as far as like technology and kind of the overall adoption? Because obviously on Bitcoin Twitter it's the common saying we're still early, but I think in that kind of bubble it gets a little lost at a certain point about just how early we are.
Yeah, so in that article, I just looked at Bitcoin through the lens of it being a new emerging technology that I expect it to gain mass adoption. And if you look at all of the adoptions of prior technologies, such as like the smartphone or the internet or the personal computer, they follow an adoption curve that takes the shape of an S. So most people would have heard of an S curve adoption chart. And there's a couple of really interesting charts and graphics that kind of show the average time it takes for a technology to go from 0 to 100% adoption. So a lot of these emerging disruptive technologies that have reached mass adoption in the late 20th century and early 21st century, they go for a very similar pattern. So typically, it takes these technologies around 10 years to go from 0 to 10% adoption. And then you kind of hit an inflection point, you reach a critical mass, and it takes the same amount of time to go from 10% adoption to 90% adoption. So pretty much mainstream. So Bitcoin today, it is, around 13, 14 years old. I believe that it's in that second phase of its adoption cycle. I actually think that 2020 was the large inflection point where I believe Bitcoin has fundamentally changed. And I believe it is crossing the chasm is another kind of term in a book that articulates how a technology goes from that 10% adoption to the 90% adoption. It needs to kind of enter the mainstream consciousness. And that's where I think Bitcoin is. I think a lot of the volatility it's experiencing today is because it's slowly being adopted wide around the world. So obviously, like, country adoptions in different countries vary. So maybe in America, adoption might be 5 or 10% in Bitcoin, but countries like Nigeria, adoption's over 30%. So it's actually over 40%. And obviously other countries like Turkey and Argentina, Bitcoin adoption is a lot higher. So I think the core premise of that article was to say, okay, in the next bull run or one of these bull runs in the 2020s, I believe that Bitcoin isn't going to experience these diminishing returns. I believe it's actually going to go through a super cycle. Obviously, super cycle is a little bit of a meme from 2021 because it hasn't played out that way. The central banks have tightened and Bitcoin's crashed all the way down to 17,000. But the core premise of that article was for the first 10 years of Bitcoin's life, 99.99% of people who were trading Bitcoin were retail traders. They were small money, they were degeneratives, they were gamblers. I know because I was one of them. I was speculating on Bitcoin and trading shitcoins in 2017 and 18. I didn't know what Bitcoin was. But the premise of the article is saying, okay, I think Bitcoin's fundamentally changing. And after 2020, when the money printers got turned on, I believe that was the first time when the large money and large capital allocators, such as CEOs of public companies like Michael Saylor and Elon Musk, such as nation states, and sovereign wealth funds, I believe after 2020, this is the first time that they have started paying interest to Bitcoin, and they've started actually, in my eyes, I think they're accumulating Bitcoin today. So I think the bull markets in the 2020s, they're going to look very, very different to what we saw in the first 10 years of Bitcoin's adoption cycle. I've said a lot there. I'll pause for a minute and let you pull that apart any way you want to.
Yeah, no worries. So this is, I do agree with you that, adoption and as far as like, plebs and everybody kind of getting into it, nation states, maybe some of the smaller, nation states as well, kind of getting in, we've seen obviously adoption in Latin America start to take off and in some of these other parts of the world that, their fiat currencies are extremely volatile. But here's where I'm going to push back and maybe I'd like to see you kind of go deeper into it is, how do you see the potential of like maybe a global depression or even, just a prolonged recession kind of affect this adoption? Because, two things that kind of worry me about it right now is that, people are going to be kind of running low on fiat. Whether it's, in the United States, for example, we're seeing credit card debt run up dramatically and the amount of personal household savings dropping down a bunch. Obviously we've had student loans kind of being pushed back quite a bit. And, there's those loans are probably going to have to be paid at some point in time as well. So, not only that, it has me kind of worried of, people maybe not using their fiat to purchase Bitcoin, at least in the United States at this point. And on the flip side, I am kind of worried about the Bitcoin miners because although, the price doesn't really matter for, plebs like you or I, it does matter for a lot of those miners. And we've seen a lot of these mining companies kind of go under, file for bankruptcy and some of these other things. So do you think, maybe the potential of this overall global, macro environment is going to kind of prolong that, that takeoff, I guess, for adoption, or do you think that that might even accelerate it just because people start to see the volatility in their own fiat currency?
Yeah, I think it's 100% accelerated it. The article I wrote about Bitcoin, looking at it through the lens of a technology, that was in late 2021. So I think we were around $30,000 or $40,000 a pop per Bitcoin. And like I was saying, I believe stock to flow is a faulty model. I think all models are going to be broken in the 2020s. And I said I expect Bitcoin to reach, at least $50 million per coin by the year 2030 in today's dollars. So that's not hyperinflated dollars. I believe like if 30% of the world's wealth flows into Bitcoin, I just ran the numbers and I did some simple maths in that article. And I said, 30% of the world's money is stored in Bitcoin. You're looking at a $64 million price tag per Bitcoin. So that's purchasing power in today's dollars. I believe a Bitcoin will be buying you 6.5 Malibu beach houses by 2030 because they go for about $10 million a pop. So that was in 2021. And a lot of people have read that article and they said, okay, Luke, you wrote that when Bitcoin was about $40,000. Today, Bitcoin's, $17,000. Central banks are tightening monetary policy. It looks as if maybe inflation's, peaked a little bit here in the US. I don't think it has though. But a lot of people are, that's their biggest pushback against that thesis. And I believe everything we've seen has just accelerated the timeline on how I believe hyper-Bitcoinization will play out. And it's just kind of confirmed the thesis for me. So we've watched central banks all around the world try to raise rates and they've all failed. Europe, Japan, Australia, every central bank around the world has had to pause interest rates and start printing money. The Bank of England's a great example. Inflation's above 10% in the UK and they've come out and they're printing money to bail out the pension funds. And what I think is really interesting is that week when England announced that pivot, you saw one of the largest daily volumes of people buying Bitcoin with British pounds that we've seen over the past 2 years. So that means there was more people buying Bitcoin with British pounds in Britain and Europe last month than there was during the entire 2021 bull market, which was pretty incredible for me. And it just kind of says, okay, yes, the US may be trying to raise interest rates aggressively, but a byproduct of the US raising rates is they're going to blow up all of these other emerging market currencies around the world. And when you have inflation at 10% in Britain and the Bank of England printing money, people are going to race out of holding the British pound and they're going to go straight to Bitcoin. Like the British pound's at a 37-year low measured against the dollar. That's not even factoring in 10% inflation, which is a faulty metric. Inflation is probably like 20% in Britain. So I believe everything we've seen is wildly bullish for Bitcoin. And to the point about a global depression, I couldn't agree more. If the Fed continues to raise rates, we're going to see a global depression. And if they don't pivot, the banking system all around the world, so the entire Eurodollar market banking system, I believe it's going to freeze and blow up. The same way that in the 2008 global financial recession, if the Fed didn't come out with that TARP bill, the $700 billion of money they had to create to bail out the banking system, the entire banking system was literally hours away from collapse. That was their words. They said, if we don't actually, print this $700 billion, the entire banking system collapses. I believe the system is just as leveraged as it was in 2007, 2008. And if the Fed does continue to raise rates and you have a global depression where banks seize and, you can no longer get your money out of the bank, that's wildly bullish for Bitcoin. But of course, that ties into the point. If there's less wealth around the world because we are in a depression, there's obviously less money that can buy Bitcoin because a lot of wealth has been destroyed. I think stocks and bonds have lost like $100 trillion of wealth in the past year. Maybe it's not that. I think it's like 60 or 70 trillion. When you include China's real estate market, I think it is over $100 trillion of wealth has been destroyed in the past year. So that's obviously a lot of people are saying, okay, that's less money that can buy Bitcoin. Yes, that's true. But I believe there's fewer and fewer sellers selling Bitcoin these days. And there's one chart that I always go back to that I believe validates that. And it's the amount of Bitcoins that's actually available for sale on exchanges. So again, for the first 12 years of Bitcoin's life, from 2008 to 2020, the number of Bitcoin on exchanges only grew. Okay, that's because people didn't understand Bitcoin. So they were mining Bitcoin, they were buying Bitcoin, and they were sending it to exchanges to sell it for fiat because they didn't get it. But in 2020, that all changed. When the money printers got turned on in early 2020, and everyone around the world, even the central bankers, sovereign wealth funds, and corporations woke up to the fact that, hang on a minute, I'm holding melting ice cubes that's losing 30 to 40% of their value a year. What you actually saw was, for the first time in Bitcoin's life, coins started leaving exchanges. Okay, so the amount of Bitcoin on exchanges peaked out at 3.1 million-ish coins in 2020. And today there's somewhere around 2.1 or 2.2 million coins left on exchanges. So all that means is over 33% of all the available Bitcoin for sale has just absolutely evaporated off exchanges, and it's moved into the wallets, who we don't know who they are, but we do know from on-chain data that these wallets who have taken the Bitcoin off exchanges, they're not selling their Bitcoin and they're not moving their Bitcoin. They're just taking it off exchanges, parking it in their own wallet, and they're accumulating it. So I think that's really interesting. And for me, I love to speculate. So I believe that's the large money around the world accumulating Bitcoin. And I believe if this trend continues since 2020, what you're going to see is by the year 2027, there's no Bitcoin left on the exchanges. And I believe the price of Bitcoin is going to go absolutely parabolic as people try to withdraw Bitcoin off the exchanges and they find out that their exchange has no Bitcoin. The price of non-KYC coin is going to absolutely moon. So I believe it doesn't matter if there's not much wealth or there's not much money flowing into Bitcoin, because I believe by 2025, 2026, 2027, you're just going to have less and less sellers of Bitcoin. So that was a lot again, and I'm guilty of going on tangents. So feel free to rope me in if I get lost down a rabbit hole, but that's how I believe it'll unfolding.
No, I mean, I agree, and that's what these are for, man. Go down the rabbit holes, just go off and go off, man. But yeah, I mean, I agree with you, and you made a lot of interesting points there, especially about pulling Bitcoin off exchanges, which I think is a trend that's going to continue as well. Especially when we're seeing a lot of these companies, like obviously the FTX, that's the big headline these days. But even before that, we had Celsius, Voyager, some of these other ones. And it seems like there's been a big question too, whether it's GBTC, like, do they actually have the Bitcoin that they claim? All these different things, like people are starting to become aware that maybe some of these companies and custodians are issuing paper Bitcoin. And so I think people want to kind of pull it off and verify that, this is actually the Bitcoin that they have. So I look for that to continue. And obviously, that's going to make Bitcoin more valuable just because it's not on an exchange where it's easily kind of transferable. And so, yeah, I mean, I agree with you there. And I think like that's, you called that shot on the Bitcoin price. So, I mean, on today's dollar terms, you never know. I mean, that could be even, higher or more elevated, just because, at this point, we don't really know what the Fed's going to do. I'd be, I mean, a lot of people like to speculate whether they're going to kind of continue to raise rates. And I know you're good friends with friends of the program, Phil Gibson, and he's kind of, his theory is, the Fed's going to continue to raise rates to destroy that offshore dollar market. And he's kind of got me coming around to that theory as well. And so, whether today's dollar terms kind of doesn't inflate as dramatically as it has in the past, I'm not really sure. But, I think that there's a lot of question marks kind of going ahead for Bitcoin, but we are seeing a lot of positives in this space. Obviously El Salvador seems to be kind of doing pretty well for itself, even though people like to point at, obviously since El Salvador has begun purchasing Bitcoin, it's gone down in dollar terms. But I believe you've been at adopting Bitcoin. You've been kind of hanging around El Salvador. So why don't you talk about your experience there and just like overall kind of the development that you're seeing, in that area?
Yeah, so El Salvador is a beautiful country. I've been living in El Salvador for nearly 3 months now, and it's beautiful. I think a lot of people have a lot of opinions on El Salvador, but I would encourage them to go there first before voicing very strong opinions. I was a little bit concerned before coming here, listening to all the propaganda and how it's had one of the highest murder rates in the world before 2022. But I think a lot has changed. Like Bukele, I'm not a fan of martial law, but he's implemented martial law to squash all of the gang violence. And I like to ask a lot of the locals, okay, have you noticed a difference in the past 6 months? And they're overwhelmingly positive of that decision by Bukele. So, and it's very safe. Like I'm a gringo, so I stand out like a sore thumb, especially with my shitty haircut. So I get stared at all the time over here, being a gringo walking around the streets of El Salvador topless, doing some cardio, doing all sorts of crazy things. But I feel really safe here. So in terms of the politics, I think it's been transformed. And then obviously you start to look at the economics of it, and it has also seen a transformation from some of the things Bukele has done. Like tourism is up 90% since he made Bitcoin legal tender. That's enormous. And obviously Bitcoiners all around the world are coming to El Salvador to live here, which is kind of crazy that people from Australia, Canada, New Zealand, all of these quote unquote first world developed democratic safe havens, people are literally escaping these countries to seek out freedom in El Salvador. Like that's the core reason I left Australia. Love the country, beautiful weather, beautiful people, beautiful beaches. But I left because my freedoms were being significantly squashed. Let's just leave it there. So it's pretty crazy that people in developed parts of the world and formerly known as democratic countries are fleeing their countries because they're scared of the rules being implemented in them. And that just kind of goes back to the sovereign individual thesis. So El Salvador is a beautiful country. I didn't see as much as the Adopting Bitcoin conference as I would have liked. I was working that week, but I got out to dinner pretty much every night and caught up with a lot of Bitcoiners there. And it was an amazing vibe at the conference. It's lots of Bitcoiners. There's no shit coinery there, which was nice. I think last year when they had the Adopting Bitcoin conference, there was also a shitcoin conference going on at the same time. I think it was called La BitConf or something like that. Had a funky name. I don't remember it, but there's a lot of shitcoiners in town this time last year. But this year it was just the Adopting Bitcoin conference. It was amazing. It was a great time.
Yeah, and that's good to see that, it is kind of just transitioning to Bitcoin only, and they're not kind of dabbling in any of the shit coins, especially with, what's going on in that kind of market. You're seeing the crazy volatility, and, obviously, that whole side seems to be kind of blowing up. But yeah, I mean, it seems like a lot of positives have gone into, obviously Bukele and Bitcoin, but it seems like they are, from an outsider looking in, they are still really early as far as it goes from the local perspective when it comes to, using Bitcoin. At least that's kind of like what I was seeing on Twitter. Are you kind of noticing that as well? Like not everywhere maybe accepts it, but very few people kind of paying it?
Oh, 100%. A lot of people hear the headlines and they say, oh, Bitcoin's legal tender in El Salvador. That means adoption must be 100%. And I thought that for maybe a week or two as well in 2021. I was a bit excited. But then obviously you see reports of reality, and adoption isn't that high. If I had to kind of pinpoint it and guess, I would say maybe adoption's somewhere between 10 and 20%. In the city in San Salvador and El Zonte, it's probably maybe slightly higher, 20 to 30% adoption. So a lot of the developed merchants, they are accepting Bitcoin. I personally haven't had to use dollars many times in my 3 months here because all of the supermarkets accept Bitcoin. You can buy your phone data with Bitcoin, fruits, veggies, meat, everything. So it's pretty good, but it's not as high as a lot of people make it out to be. And obviously, but I talked to people who were here in 2021 when the bill just got passed in September. And they said they've seen massive improvements in firstly, just the number of businesses accepting Bitcoin, and then just the Lightning Network being slightly more reliable. There was a couple of bugs and issues with the Chivo wallet early on, but a lot of that looks to be resolved. And everything seems to be improving at a pretty rapid rate, which is great to see.
Yeah, and I think, a lot of the critics, I don't really understand the argument because, obviously we were talking about first world developed countries like Americans, Canadians, Australians like yourself, kind of going to El Salvador or jumping around. And, El Salvador before this, there's no way to kind of put this kind of lightly. It was known as like a third world country. And, a third world country isn't necessarily going to be fixed overnight or from one little change or something like that. And as well as with adoption, completely changing the currency or making Bitcoin legal tender, not everybody's just going to magically turn all their dollars into Bitcoin right away and just kind of start doing that. So, I'm kind of looking for the adoption to kind of keep increasing. And that's the general sense of what I'm hearing is more people are kind of, using it and they're kind of seeing the incentives. And that kind of brings me to another point too, is that are you kind of noticing some businesses come down there? Because from what I understand too, a lot of these Bitcoin businesses or other businesses in general, you don't have to pay taxes necessarily if you're a business there, but you operate in another country. So say you're a Bitcoin business, you operate in the US, but your headquarters is in El Salvador. You hire El Salvadorians or people that are kind of spending money in El Salvador. You don't necessarily have to pay business tax. I don't know if you know the exact laws on that, but are you kind of noticing some businesses kind of start to come down and be headquartered down there as well?
Lots of Bitcoin only businesses here in El Salvador. I don't know the exact laws, but I do believe it's something like that, 0% capital gains tax, and I don't know the income laws tax, but if there is any, I remember it's very low as well, if not zero. So yeah, Bitcoin businesses are absolutely flocking here to El Salvador, and it's great to see.
Yeah, for sure. And then, so I'm going to bring it back and transition it to a little bit back to the dollar because, we've seen the dollar. We talked about it a little bit with the Fed back and forth, raising interest rates and everything. And, you made a pretty, I guess, great argument for what I'll say about the U.S. Potentially weaponizing the dollar by backing it with Bitcoin. And I think it's overall pretty interesting because from my view, before I read your article, I kind of thought that the US would have the most to lose when it comes to adopting Bitcoin, just because they have currently the global reserve currency and everything like that. But, your whole theory kind of starts around the dollar milkshake theory. So for those in the audience that don't know that, why don't you kind of get into that? And then we'll kind of break down your theory about how the US could potentially weaponize the dollar by backing it by Bitcoin.
Yeah, so that is the common misconception or the common view. Okay, if Bitcoin is going to be the next global reserve currency of the world, this is terrible for the US because they have the global reserve currency. And I kind of took the absolute opposite side of that argument with the article. But starting with the dollar milkshake theory, so essentially it was a great thesis proposed by, I think it was Brent Johnson in 2018, maybe 2019. I think it was 2018. And he just said, hey, look, I believe in the next recession, it's not going to be a garden variety recession. I believe we're heading towards the end game of this, 80-year financial system that we've currently been operating under. And Brent believes that we're going to get into a sovereign debt crisis, which is going to morph into a sovereign currency crisis. And Brent believes you're going to see a wave of dominoes all around the world hyperinflate. And he believes that the United States is going to be the last currency left standing in a wave of sovereign currency crises all around the world. The reason for that is because the US is still the global reserve currency. So 70% of global trade still happens in US dollars. And Brent, and obviously because we've been operating with the US at the core of the reserve currency status for the past 80 years, what you've seen is lots of these countries have taken on a lot of US dollar denominated debt. And so obviously when you have a recession or a global depression, what happens is people are really fearful with what they do with their money. So when people are fearful, they rush to safety. And today, safety is still the US dollars because countries all around the world have debt denominated in dollars. So when you see people rush to safety, makes the dollar stronger. And when the dollar gets stronger, that's why you see the index like the Dixie get stronger, which has gone from like 85 to 116 in the past 12 months. And when the Dixie gets stronger, all of those debts around the world that are denominated in US dollars, they become harder and harder to pay. So if you're in Turkey or Argentina and you're a corporation with US dollar denominated debt, well, you've got a really big issue because you're receiving your income in the local currency, Turkish lira and Argentinian pesos, and you need to pay your debts in the US dollar, which is getting exponentially stronger. So the thesis that Brent lays out is, okay, as these countries around the world have issues servicing their debt, what they're going to have to do is they're going to have to print their local currency, devalue their local currency, and then go into the open Forex markets and trade the local currency for the dollar to pay their US dollar denominated debt. And it's just essentially a feedback loop that gets that makes the US dollar become stronger and stronger over time. So that I think that's kind of the thesis. I know we're live. I might have to pause here and grab the charger for my laptop because she's about to go flat. But is that okay if we pause for a sec?
Yeah, go for it, man. Go for it.
Sorry, man.
No worries. No worries. The low budget operation here at Green Candle. This is the kind of audio content you come here for. But yeah, while Luke is grabbing his charger, I'll give a little preface here. So, obviously we're talking right now about his article and how, the U.S. could potentially weaponize the dollar. We're talking about now how, some of the negatives about, the U.S. having the global reserve currency. And I'm just kind of going over a little bit about what you're saying, painting the picture a little bit for the potential of a Bitcoin-backed dollar. At the end of the day, a lot of these world-denominated debts in the U.S. dollar, it just seems like it's going to keep kind of exponentially growing as the dollar becomes weaker and weaker. And a lot of these countries are going to essentially, just not be able to pay that back. So is that, kind of, I guess, the viewpoint that you have for the reasoning of moving a little bit towards like the Bitcoin-backed dollar? Or, why don't you kind of get into that thesis?
Yeah, so the reason that I believe the US will be forced to back the dollar with Bitcoin is because I think you're going to get into a situation where people lose faith in the US dollar despite everybody having to dollarize itself due to its local currency blowing up. So obviously we have inflation in the United States. People are losing faith in the dollar. And what you're watching is the BRICS nations all around the world come out and announce, you know what? We're not going to use US dollars anymore. We're creating a new reserve currency. So this is actually what the BRICS nations announced in June this year. So for anyone who doesn't know, that's Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. At the 14th annual BRICS summit, they get together every year and they normally just talk about geopolitics. This year, they came out with a big announcement and they said, yeah, we created a new reserve currency. We don't give a shit about the US dollar anymore. And for anyone who's familiar with history and the US's involvement in the Middle East, they will know that's a pretty dangerous thing to say because obviously Libya, Gaddafi tried to get Libya onto a gold standard in 1996 and 1999. And we all know what happened to Gaddafi. There's some pretty graphic videos on the internet showing what happened to him after the US invaded Libya. And then obviously Iraq tried to do the same thing. They tried to get off the dollar standard in the year 2000. And because Iraq started selling oil in euros in 2000, and obviously Iraq got invaded the next year and had bombs dropped on their head by the US. So typically saying you're not going to use the US dollar and escaping the petrodollar system hasn't been a very wise move for countries. It's been a very dangerous move to take. But you've just watched 5 countries, the BRICS countries, who represent over 40% of global GDP, come out and give the US the middle finger. So it's a massive announcement. Nobody's talking about it. That shocks me. So I see that as like an economic act of war. So that's like an economic Cold War going on right now. BRICS nations are saying, yep, we've had enough of the US dollar. We're getting out. And to compound the issue, you've got, I think it's another 6 or 7 countries around the world who are also applying to become a part of that BRICS nations. So you're watching countries like Argentina, Egypt, Saudi Arabia. There's a few other countries, that Turkey as well. All of these countries are applying to become a part of the BRICS. It's also showing that they don't want to use US dollars anymore. So there's rumors that the BRICS countries are going to back their new reserve currency by gold, and I believe that's exactly what they're going to do, because Russia, they're the most backed fiat currency in terms of how much fiat reserves they have compared to the amount of gold they hold. So they're one of the biggest holders in the world, Russia, on a per capita basis. Obviously, India, if you look domestically in India, the people have valued gold for thousands of years, and that's pretty much what they save their money in. Let's look at another country in the BRICS, China. So China's official gold holdings is like 1 or 2,000 metric tons. But what they don't tell you about China is they're actually sitting on well over 20,000 metric tons of gold. If you go back and look at the amount of gold they've imported versus the amount of gold they've exported over the past 15 years, you can see that there's over 20,000 metric tons of gold sitting in China, because the CCP doesn't let the gold miners export the gold. And you can see clearly how much gold they've imported. So they're sitting on the most gold in the world, 3 times what the US supposedly holds in Fort Knox. That's if we do hold the gold. So I believe that, okay, we're operating on a US dollar system today that's backed by paper. I believe that if the BRICS nations come out with a new reserve currency and it's backed by gold, I think people are probably going to trust that more than a paper-backed US dollar. Even if, yes, we hate Russia, we don't trust China and their fake gold, which they've been exposed to using in the past, I think people are still going to trust a gold-backed or a commodity-backed reserve currency more than a paper-backed US dollar. So that kind of leaves the US in a little bit of a predicament. What are they going to do if all of these countries are leaving the US dollar and they're going to use a gold-backed, whatever we're going to call it, a ruble yuan, or whatever you want to call the BRICS new reserve currency? I believe that the US is forced with their backs in the corner. I think the only move they can make on that chessboard is to back the dollar by Bitcoin, because what is more trustworthy than a gold-backed BRICS reserve currency? I believe it's a Bitcoin-backed US dollar. I think that is far more trustworthy than a BRICS gold-backed currency, even if it's backed by, say, 5% of Bitcoin. So that was kind of the premise of the article. We went down lots of different rabbit holes in that one, but that's the kind of high-level TLDR of it.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it is kind of an interesting time right now too, because not only do we have that, we kind of have a potential of World War III going on. So it's not only like kind of like economic warfare going on, it might be actual warfare. And when it comes to that, yeah, I think the U.S. announced either today or sometime earlier this week that they're sending another $4.5 billion to Ukraine. So I mean, it's at this point, it's like, where is all this money kind of coming from? They're shipping a bunch of money over there to kind of fend off Russia from the Ukraine. And it's like, okay, you kind of connect the dots here. Like, why are they really doing that? And it kind of leads to your point, right? It's like, as soon enough, it might be another, maybe a potential of like World War III kind of thing, where it's like BRICS versus, everybody else. And it seems like they're kind of not only using the dollar in kind of economic warfare, but they're using a lot of, obviously energy. We talked about, or people have talked about, Trump bringing up a few years ago, Germany, the reliance that they had on Russian oil and gas, and then, how that would cause a huge issue if Russia, kind of held them by that. And, look what's kind of going on over there. So we're almost having like a European energy crisis as well. And I don't think that's like, I mean, they were kind of saying a few months ago that this is going to be one of the coldest winters ever. And I don't really hear anything about that anymore as we're kind of creeping up along that. So, I think that there's a lot of other factors here too that could lead to that. But I guess my little pushback to that is like, do you think that the policymakers in the U.S., do you have faith in them to kind of go that direction? Because it seems like, up until this point, the current party that's in power has been very resistant to Bitcoin and kind of, I guess, just diving into that ESG narrative, finding all FUD that they possibly can to kind of go against it.
Yeah, so this kind of goes back to the thesis that the US Fed is weaponizing interest rates to bankrupt the Eurodollar market and Davos and Klaus Schwab and the Great Reset. The thesis put forward by Tom Luongo in 2021, which is a brilliant thesis, he stipulates that there's factions within the United States. So there's a faction within the US which is trying to implement these ESG agendas, which you see most prominently in Europe. So that's obviously trying to force the oil and gas companies to transition to solar and wind. And this is like a core premise of like the Great Reset. They want us using unreliable forms of energy. They want us using less energy. So Tom's kind of pointed out, hey, you have puppets like Joe Biden and Janet Yellen and a lot of these kind of like Democrats. They're pretty much puppets of Klaus Schwab, and they're on team kill America. They're on team we don't care about America. We're implementing the Great Reset. We want to print a bunch of money, devalue the US dollar, all in the name of climate change. So that's one part of a certain group that's within the US. And then Tom Luongo kind of says, hey, look, there might be another faction within the US itself that is actually looking out for the US's interests. So they may represent the Federal Reserve, which is being told what to do by the commercial banks in the US, who have just recently done a massive pivot on this whole green agenda. So Jamie Dimon's come out bashing the green agenda, saying we can't do what Europe's doing. This is idiotic. This is crazy. So I think that's a really interesting thing to watch the divergence within the United States itself. But if you look at the US, I think we're still posturing more friendly towards Bitcoin than any other nation in the G7 is. So I think that's also something to keep an eye on as well, because despite having Biden and these Davos-controlled Democrats trying to actively destroy America, you're still watching, relatively favorable regulations and laws be pushed in America. And I think the fact that it's a republic is really beneficial as well, because states like Florida, states like Texas, even Arizona, I think they're going to trip over themselves to make Bitcoin legal tender. Even if you have the Democrats and even Biden try to sign some really Orwellian laws that kind of make Bitcoin adoption unfavorable in the country, I think the US is sitting in a pretty nice position compared to these other countries like Europe, for example. They've banned self-custody wallets. That's full Orwell. And you have the new World Economic Forum puppet that's been installed in England. He's coming out and saying, yeah, we love central bank digital currencies on a retail level. And obviously Australia as well. We're not looking very, very favorable towards Bitcoin over there. We're looking more, to go down the kind of 1984 Orwell path and follow our good friends Europe and Britain down that kind of way. So I think, yes, there's some negative things in the US surrounding Bitcoin, like New York trying to put what is it called? I can't pronounce the word, but they're
talk about Miranda rights.
Yeah, something like that. Like apart from small laws like the New York trying to kind of squash Bitcoin mining, I think overall as a country, it's looking far more favorable versus other countries in the G7.
Yeah, and I agree with you. And here's another, I guess, little tidbit that I would bring up, and I want to hear your thoughts because, I've heard Saylor kind of talk about it, and some of these other CEOs that are kind of involved with Bitcoin. But it's at the end of the day, the U.S. is all about money. It's a capitalist country, and they really care about all this money and jobs and everything like that. So, my argument would be if you're going to make like negative policies when it comes to Bitcoin and some of these other things and like some of these regulations, then why would the SEC kind of allow a company like MicroStrategy to hold so much Bitcoin? You would think that there would kind of be some regulations around that. And then there's also a lot of Bitcoin mining companies that have gone public in the US. And so if they thought they were all kind of, I guess, frauds, or that the SEC wasn't really doing their due diligence behind it, I feel like a lot more regulations would be placed, and there wouldn't be as many publicly traded Bitcoin miners. I believe there's an ETF too around Bitcoin miners. So I don't think that they would allow that if they were planning on, or at least questioning kind of the validity of Bitcoin. So I think to your point, it might be that they're just kind of, loud in the media and kind of some of their speeches, but like behind closed doors, they're kind of supporting it in a sense. Do you kind of, I guess, do you kind of see where I'm coming from there, or do you not hold any weight when it comes to some of these publicly traded companies?
No, 100%. You absolutely hit the nail on the head. I prefer to look at somebody's actions as opposed to what they're saying loud and proud in the media. Like if you were the US, and I believe if you were trying to back the dollar with Bitcoin, I think every single step the US has taken over the past 24 months is exactly what they should do if they were going to back the dollar by Bitcoin. You wouldn't announce it. You would put out, you would get the Elizabeth Warrens and, all of the idiots to start shrieking negative things about Bitcoin in the press. And you would kind of walk that tightrope between saying, yeah, Bitcoin's okay. And then you could say, oh, Bitcoin's for criminals. But you actually, with your actions, you allow MicroStrategy to speculatively attack the dollar and borrow billions of dollars borrow billions of dollars and actually buy Bitcoin. I think that's a massive move. And then obviously you've got the largest oil and gas companies like ExxonMobil. I think they're the largest oil and gas company in the US. And they were actually, before they announced they were mining Bitcoin, I believe they were actually invited to a meeting at the White House with like 5 or 6 other companies, or there was a very small handful of individuals at that meeting. I don't remember the specifics. It was earlier this year. But they were at a meeting at the White House, and then a couple of weeks later it comes out and it says they're mining Bitcoin to diminish their carbon emissions. So I think like there's some really big signposts that the US is posturing favorably towards Bitcoin. You've even had Janet Yellen, who I regard as a Davos-controlled Yoda troll. She's actually even come out and said Satoshi Nakamoto's innovation is real. Gary Gensler said the exact same thing. Who's obviously the head of the SEC. So you have people very high up, head of the Treasury and the SEC, both able to actually distinguish the difference between Bitcoin and crypto. That's massive. You don't see that in Europe or UK or Australia or any other developed G20 nation. It's all just crypto, blockchain, CBDC. That's all they talk about. But in America, the narrative is very different. It's Bitcoin, and then there's all these other 22,000 unregulated securities. And then, we'll think about doing a CBDC at a wholesale level in the future. So I think the discussion in the US is very interesting if you're paying attention, that is.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, the biggest distinction too that Gensler said is that it's Bitcoin and then everything else is a security. So, I agree with you on that point too, is like, if you listen a little closely and you kind of watch some of their actions, I do kind of see where you're coming from with the potential of the Bitcoin backed dollar. So I'll be looking for that in the future, and maybe your thesis will become right, and we'll have you back on the show. But you've been very generous with your time, so I really appreciate you coming on and discussing all this with me. Why don't you tell people what you got going on and where they can find you?
Yeah, so I'm on Twitter. I shitpost on Twitter all day, every day. My handle is Luke Mikic 21. Obviously, Amber. I write lots of articles at Amber. We just rolled out to 62 countries. So to celebrate, we're giving everybody $10 of free Bitcoin if they sign up with Amber. So you guys can feel free to go grab yourself $10 of free Bitcoin. I think it's linked in my bio on my Twitter profile. Because I think $10 Bitcoin is going to be worth a lot of value in the future if we do reach a kind of hyper Bitcoinized world where one Bitcoin is $65 million. Got to run the numbers. What is that? Does that mean every dollar today is worth like $4,000 by 2030 in today's purchasing power? Something like that. So.
Yeah.
With Bitcoin at 15,000, you've got to slap about a 4x on it, so 4,000x. Stack accordingly, ladies and gentlemen. So yeah, I shit post on Twitter. I write articles on Amber. I manage the Coinbeast social media account also on Twitter, so keep an eye on that. Obviously got my own YouTube and podcast channel, so that's Bitcoin Made Simple. And yeah, I just thank you so much for having me on, dude. It's been an absolute blast, and I love checking out your spaces on Twitter. So if there's anyone listening here on the podcast apps, they should definitely check out your discussions on Twitter, because I always pop into those as well to talk some shit. So I love everything
Yeah.
you're doing, man, and thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks so much for coming on. And yeah, we'll have to have you on. And yeah, pop into the spaces. You'll hear Luke live there. You can ask him some questions, maybe heckle him a bit on his
Yeah.
thesis and whatnot too. So yeah, be sure to pop in there. And yeah, Luke, thanks so much.
Thank you for having me. I invite the heckling, so please come